So I've had a difficult time. I grew up in like my dad was traditional, right? My mom stayed at home, so I had a stay-at-home mom, and I was always I had this kind of a difficult time understanding what I was supposed to do because on one hand I was told getting a PhD was massively important, going to university was massively important, but also you should be a stay-at-home mom. And I can remember as a teenager like adding up the years and being like, okay, if it's
Yeah.
easiest to have kids in your 20s, but I'm also supposed to get a PhD. Like, it wasn't even bachelor degrees, like that's for sure, but like PhD is
hmm
what you really want. It's like, how do I do both? And I can remember just being like, I don't know if I can. Like, I don't know if I can do both unless, like, I don't know how I can do both. And then I had some health problems, which delayed schooling and was like, okay, well, now the years are completely off. I'm not going to get a PhD till I'm like 31. And then like how do you balance everything in there? um, and I think I had a difficult time understanding what the average female is like because I'm extremely disagreeable, and for my entire life I thought everybody else was just like me. Like, it wasn't until I was 24. I have no idea why this was because my dad being who he is, I knew people had personality differences, but I couldn't wrap my head around what those actually manifested like.
hmm
So when I had conversations, I couldn't understand why people acted differently in conversations than I did till I was like 24. I don't know if other people have that problem, but it took me a long time. And it was difficult for me to figure out what I should feel like. And so the conversation is interesting because I don't think I think like the average female because my disagreeableness is so high. What do you think the average female looks like? What do you think they
Agreeable.
want?
I'm super
Agreeable.
agreeable. So yeah, so which I do think actually is a real factor in all this sexual culture stuff. So a question I get sometimes is why are women putting up with this? Why would women put up with a culture that is not geared towards their preferences? Just anecdotally, and also in media culture, whatever, you see so many examples of women who will um, go along with situationships, so called, right? Or have casual sexual relationships without any kind of commitment, without even displays of affection, which they desperately crave, and will do pornified sex acts that they don't enjoy, that they don't really want to do, but they're trying to please this man, whatever. And the question is, why would women put up with this when in general women are generally the sex with more choices when it comes to mates, because we know from all the dating app data, which has proved to be so useful for sex researchers, that the hypergamy instinct in women, the subconscious desire to marry up and to be drawn towards higher status men than oneself, which men don't have. Men are quite happy to generally have relationships with women of the same or lower status than themselves, but women are not, means that you end up with women kind of clustering towards the higher status men. I think the figures on Tinder is it's like 10% of men get 60% of likes, the top 10% of men, that is. And then the bottom 90% are getting very little. Whereas women are generally get a lot of likes, but they're getting likes from men that they're not interested in. And I think that what's going on is because you've lifted the monogamy restriction, not legally, you know, polygamy is still illegal, at least in the UK. That is probably the next frontier.
Yeah.
The polyamorous are going to start clamoring to have their relationships recognized in law. But for now, it's still illegal. But in practice, because premarital and extramarital sex is now socially acceptable, these high status men who in previous era would have got married and would have removed themselves from the dating pool instead are able to be serially monogamous, or even able to have simultaneous relationships with women who might not even realize, you know, they're part of these harems, right? Digital harems. And I
Hmm.
I think that's why those women end up, those high status men are able to really, really set the terms, because if a woman doesn't say have sex on the first date, it's easy enough to find another woman who will. So you end up with a slightly artificial level of competition between women who, you know, there are actually enough men to go around, but there aren't enough men that they actually want to be with to go around. And so they're competing for a minority of men who basically have, I mean, it's kind of open season. They can demand that their own preferences be met.
So what's the solution here now that we're in this predicament?
I mean, on an individual level, it is quite possible for people to just choose to be a bit more trad. The challenge is, of course, finding a partner who wants that too. But I'm noticing around me a quite a significant turn
Yeah.
against this stuff. It's increasingly common in elite circles as well. You know, there's this apparent turn towards Catholicism among young New Yorkers, and I see it among young Londoners as well. A greater conservatism among
Yeah.
a sort of subsection of the elite. You can choose to do that. You know, you can still get married, you can still not have premarital sex, you can still choose to be a stay-at-home mum, have loads of children. I mean, it's more difficult because things like being a stay-at-home mum in an economic environment where that's really challenging is just harder than it used to be. You won't have the social support that you used to have if that's the route that you're choosing. You will forego status to some extent, but it's still possible. So I do have advice for readers along those lines. You know, you I think that one change that could come about quite easily is just, I think part of the, sorry, I was saying before that part of the reason why you see women putting up with nonsense is because of the hypergamy effect. But I think the other reason is to do with agreeableness. And agreeable people just find it really difficult to be assertive in those situations. And when, for instance, the norm becomes having sex on a first date, and indeed the norm becomes having sex before marriage per se. You know, it used to be that if the social expectation was that you wouldn't have sex before marriage, then there's no conversation. It is just assumed after a date that, you know, we will not be having sex. That's the default. Now the default is to have sex. And that means that women are put in this situation, sometimes very agreeable women who are really keen to please these, you know, these desirable men, whatever, where they have to be defending their own sexual boundaries, even if they're actually quite reluctant. And it's often what you see in Me Too cases, where women are describing situations where they're you know, they're with a man who potentially they are actually quite romantically interested in after a date, whatever. Aziz Ansari was the famous example. Do you remember that one? The actor Aziz Ansari, who had a date with a woman, went back to his place, and she didn't want to have sex. He did. He didn't rape her. There wasn't anything illegal that happened. She never really said no, but she also was a bit
Yeah.
reluctant, and made it evident non-verbally that she was reluctant. He apparently didn't think so. And they ended up having sex, and she felt really violated and felt really distressed, and she later wrote about this, and it became a whole thing. She had to express what happened in the terms of consent, and so the conversation that happened afterwards was this really consensual? What was this sexual assault, etc.? I think the answer to that is no. It wasn't sexual assault on a legal level, but it also wasn't good.
Yeah.
And he didn't behave well, and he didn't behave like a gentleman, right? Is what you would have said historically. He didn't behave like a gentleman. He didn't demonstrate chivalry. He put pressure on a woman who he ought to have recognized was reluctant. But the thing is that when the expectation, particularly when you're talking about a fan going on a date with a celebrity, which is the circumstances there, and they've gone back to his house, the expectation was that they would have sex. And so it was incumbent on her to be assertive and to say no. And agreeable people find that really hard. So I think
Yeah.
that's very often what's going on. And I think that if there's one change that could happen quite swiftly, potentially, is if we had a bit of a change in norms and expectations, and if women felt more confident in demanding certain things. I hear so often from young women in particular this, you know, I'm afraid of being frigid, I'm afraid of being a prude,
Yeah.
I'm afraid of being considered low status because I don't want to do XYZ. If the status flipped and different expectations were in place, then I think you would see women and therefore men behaving quite differently, because women are the gatekeepers, you know, most of the time. What you see now, for instance, at the moment, is there's this dreadful phenomenon on TikTok of young women showing off their bruises that they've got from having rough sex with their boyfriends, like really young women, teenagers, say that they've got bruises on their neck, and they'll like take TikToks of them, and this is considered to be really desirable. I think all women will show off about how many partners they've had. I think that that's coming from a misunderstanding of male sexuality. I think that because we're all kind of collectively in denial about how profoundly different men and women are on the cellular level, as we were saying, but also psychologically. And I think that a lot of young women don't realize that men are much more geared towards having emotionless sex than they are, and
Yeah.
actually are much more willing to have sex
Yeah.
with women. They wouldn't care if they got hit by a bus next week, frankly. And so things like having, being able to entice a man into bed, or to have rough sex or whatever, is not actually much of an achievement. It's pretty easy to do that, particularly as a young woman. But because of that misunderstanding of the fact that men regard sex quite differently from women, I think that these young women don't know that because they've not learned it yet, and because the culture completely misinforms them about reality. I think that if they did know that, I don't think they'd be putting these videos on TikTok.